Next, we're going to present our classic of blues recording album. This is about John Lee Hooker's real folk blues. I'd just like to squeeze in one more thing if I can, step out of line here a bit. But Willie Dixon's I Ain't Superstitious is coming up, and I represented Willie as well. He was just one of the most wonderful humans on earth. And I Ain't Superstitious, the first time I heard it, I came to the blues very late, was from the Jeff Beck group with this young 20s-ish singer, Rod Stewart, actually. But back in line here, excuse me, I hope I didn't steal anybody's thunder, but I just love Willie to death, and I just had to say that. On John Lee Hooker, here's a video about his real folk blues.
The 1966 John Lee Hooker album, Real Folk Blues, is the latest of several Chess Records Real Folk Blues albums to be elected to the Blues Hall of Fame. Whereas the rest of the LPs in the series by Muddy Waters, Howlin Wolf, and others were compilations of older recordings, the Hooker album was newly recorded in May of 1966 in Chicago. Hooker was his inimitable and spontaneous self, reworking some of his older songs and improvising new ones, accompanied by his Detroit guitarist Eddie Burns and Chicago sidemen Lafayette Leake and S.P. Leary.
All you try to do for me, to make it hard for me, baby, I better go now, baby.
As you just heard, the Real Folk Blues was the name of a series of releases by various artists, but the title, I think, was an especially perfect fit for John Lee. His music was as real as it gets. Producers might occasionally try to fit John Lee or Muddy Waters or others into a style that was popular at the time. But when John Lee sat down to play, it was always absolutely real, and that raw, deep sound just poured out of him naturally. After John Lee's initial success with Boogie Chillin' in 1948, his manager at the time made a little extra money on the side for both of them by recording with other labels under aliases like Texas Slim, Birmingham Sam and his magic guitar, Johnny Williams, and the somewhat less creative John Lee Booker. Seems like a pretty shaky business model, but it did prove, I think, from the start that regardless of the name on the label, they believed that John Lee's music could sell and win fans. So John Lee went on, however, to establish himself under his own name as well, of course. Along with Muddy, Howlin Wolf, and of course Bo Diddley and others, John Lee influenced a long list of British invasion artists, from the Rolling Stones to the Animals, Led Zeppelin, Van Morrison, and even onto David Bowie. These guys were all welcomed as major stars in Europe, even as their profile waned a bit in the United States. That changed for John Lee in 1971 as he came back into the spotlight, collaborating with Canned Heat on Hooker and Heat. That brought his boogie sound to a whole new generation of rock fans. Personally, I first booked John Lee into a club in Milwaukee when I lived there in the mid-1970s, and that relationship evolved into my becoming his exclusive agent after I started Rosebud. When Van Morrison asked John Lee about producing him in 1983, John Lee asked if I'd go discuss it with him. And I did, and it didn't work out at the time for Van to produce John Lee. But not long afterwards, George Thorogood, who had been putting a John Lee Hooker song on every record and loved John, also called me up, and I represented him at the time, called me up to say if John Lee made a new record, he would really like to be a part of it. Carlos Santana, similarly, who had been sitting in with John Lee at every chance he could get, also called me up and said he'd love to be, if there's a new record on John Lee, he'd love to be a part of it. I wasn't a manager or a producer at the time, but that whole situation inspired my concept for the Healer as basically like an audio scrapbook for John Lee and his friends to say, this is me and my friend John Lee, or this is me and my friend Carlos Santana. And so part of the concept was to record those guys together and document their collaboration and friendship. But part of the concept was also to record John Lee more or less back, getting back to the real blues without trying to chase any trend. And I should say that once we finished, it was clear that the record had much greater potential than an audio scrapbook. So we worked very hard to make sure it did as well as possible. And it was gold in countries all over the world. and won a Grammy. I mention all this because with the special guests, I would generally ask them if there was a particular song they might want to record with John Lee. Coincidentally, Bonnie Raitt suggested doing I'm in the Mood, and that recording won them both a Grammy. Van Morrison later collaborated with John Lee on a really beautiful version of I Cover the Water Brother. And John Lee also recorded a rocking version of One Bourbon, One Scotch, and One Beer with his own touring band. And we had no intention of focusing on the Real Folk Blues album, but all these songs came from that album, and they were making a brand new impact over 20 years later. I think that in itself proved again the lasting nature of John Lee's music. When John Lee was due to receive his Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award some years ago, he called me a few days beforehand and said he didn't feel up for the trip. So I asked him if he asked me to accept the award on his behalf. So I wrote a speech for him and I ran it past him to make sure he was okay with it, and he was. And I asked him, is there anything else you want to add? And he said, yeah, tell him they're not giving me anything I don't deserve. So I put it in the speech, you know? And, the same situation, though, applies here. John Lee's Real Folk Blues definitely deserves to be a Blues Hall of Fame recording, and I'm honored to be inducting it. I'm happy, in the meantime, to welcome to the stage, to accept the honor, John Lee's daughter, Zakiya Hooker.
First off, I would like to thank the Blues Foundation for the award. And I'm kind of like my father. They never gave him anything that he didn't deserve. Of course, I thought he was the greatest blues man in the world. Yeah. And I listened to Bo's daughter talk about, you know, that he had the third grade education. Well, you know, my dad had none because, you know, he worked in the fields and he ran away from home, and they brought him back and he ran away again, and then his career started. And I think I was so fortunate because the world knew him through the music. I knew him as my father. Amen. And through the music. And our household was filled with music, just filled with music. And so, and I always explain to people that when you grow up in a situation like that, it's like, you know, the formative years of children. That was my formative years. And blues is just, I love it. I just love to hear it. And I'm just really honored and pleased, you know, that they honored my father like this. And I thank you, Mike, for working with him and bringing him along, because he was a hard man to work with. Hard man to work with. And on behalf of the family, I'd like to say thank you to his fans all over the world who have made it possible for him to get to where he is, and who appreciated him and understood how unique he really is. Because he is still with us. Yeah. Through his music, he will always be with us. So as they say, I would say, all this person just let the room, John Hooker has not left the room. Thank you very much.